I'm Maria. I never really liked coming back to that house. It smelled like old paper and sour memories, the kind that hide in the corners and creep out when you're least prepared. My parents lived in that house for over 20 years. It was a square, pale thing with chipped white paint and a lawn that always looked half dead. But I didn't come back for them. I came back because my grandfather had died and I didn't know how to feel about it. His name was Samuel. He was 82 and sharp as a knife until the very end. I remember being a kid and sitting on his lap while he smoked his pipe and told me about the wars, not the kind with bullets but the kind with banks and land and names carved into deeds. He had this way of looking at you like he could see straight through the skin into the parts you didn't want anyone else to see, and still he'd smile like it was all okay, like he knew who you really were and didn't. Mindy hadn't seen him much in the past year. Work kept me too busy, or at least that's what I told myself. I worked as a police assistant, not a cop yet, but I wore the badge and I did the paperwork, and sometimes that was enough to make me feel like I mattered, so I stayed away from home, from my parents, from the silence that crept between us like fog. I knew they'd be waiting for me when I came for the funeral, and I wasn't wrong. Me mother was wearing black, but not morning black. It was more like cocktail party black. She had her hair up and her makeup perfect, not a single tear smudging her mascara. She hugged me too tightly and held on too long and said things like, "It's good to see you and you look tired and I missed you," even though we both knew none of that was true. My father barely looked at me. He stood at the edge of the porch smoking a cigarette like it was the last thing holding him together. The funeral was small. A few of my grandfather's old friends, some neighbors, and us, the family. I watched as they lowered his coffin into the ground, and I tried to feel something, anything, but all I could think about was how quiet it was. No wind, no birds, just dirt hitting wood like punctuation. I wanted to scream, but my throat was too tight and my heart felt too dry. So I stood there stiff in my uniform, hands at my sides, face blank, like I was at work. Afterward, we went back to the house, everyone pretending to be sad while sipping coffee and eating those little sandwiches that always taste like cardboard. People talked about how kind he was, how smart, how generous, and I wondered if any of them really knew him or if they just remembered the version of him that smiled at Christmas and told jokes about the weather. My mother floated through the room like a hostess at a gallery opening, and my father kept refilling his glass with whatever brown liquid he had in the cabinet. He went upstairs to his room just to be alone. The air was thick with dust and pipe smoke and something else, something like finality. I sat on his bed, the same one he used to read me bedtime stories in, and I looked around at the things he left behind. Books lined the shelves, some so worn the titles had faded completely, photos in frames cracked and yellowed, a radio that only played static, and a heavy wooden desk with its drawers slightly open, like he'd meant to finish something but never did. That's where I found the first clue, tucked inside a leather-bound notebook under a pile of old letters. It was a page written in his shaky handwriting, not dated, no salutation, no closing, just a few lines scribbled like he was afraid someone might see it. It said, "If anything happens to me, tell Maria to look for the key, the real one, not the silver. It's in the place where she first asked about the stars. They'll try to hide it, but she's smarter than they think." He read it 3 times before I could breathe again. The words didn't make sense, not fully, but they made me feel something like a spark in the dark, a pulse in the quiet. I remembered asking about the stars when I was 7. We were on the roof of the garage lying on an old blanket, and I asked him why they didn't fall. He told me because someone had to believe in them, and I said I did, and he laughed and said then they'd stay right where they were. I went out to the garage that night when everyone else had gone to sleep. I stood under the same sky, darker now, colder, and I climbed onto the roof. The shingles cracked under my boots and the wind bit at my cheeks, but I didn't stop. I searched every inch, and then I saw it, a loose tile near the chimney. Beneath it, wrapped in plastic, was a small velvet box. Inside was a key, brass, not silver, old but not rusted, and a folded piece of paper that simply said basement file cabinet bottom drawery. Didn't sleep that night. I waited until morning, pretending to be tired, pretending to be okay. I went down to the basement before anyone woke up. The air was damp and smelled like mildew and time. The cabinet was right where I remembered from when I was a kid and he used to let me help him organize papers even though I mostly just drew pictures on envelopes. I opened the bottom drawer and found a folder marked inside were documents, copies of land deeds, account numbers, letters from lawyers, all pointing to one thing: a trust fund set up in my name decades ago with specific instructions not to be touched until his passing. It was signed, sealed, and completely legal, and yet I had never heard a word about it, not from him, not from my parents. Nathanji confronted my mother first. I held the papers in my hand like evidence and I waited for her to lie. She didn't disappoint. She said she didn't know. She said he must have forgotten to tell anyone. She said maybe the documents weren't real, maybe they were old, maybe he was confused. In the end, she said what she always said, that I was being dramatic, that I was always looking for someone to blame, that maybe if I spent more time with the family I'd understand how complicated things were. My father just looked at me and said things cost money and walked out of the room. Like that explained everything, like that made it okay, that they'd hidden something that was mine, something my grandfather had wanted me to have, and they decided they knew better. They decided to take it because I wouldn't notice, because I didn't deserve it, because I wasn't one of them anymore. That was the last straw. I packed my bag and I left. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay not another minute in that house that reeked of betrayal and old lies. I drove for hours until the city lights turned to fields and the roads got quiet. I found a cheap motel off the highway and checked in under a different name. I sat on the bed with the folder in my lap and I stared at the ceiling, wondering how long they had been planning this, wondering how many smiles had been fake, how many dinners had been distractions. That night, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let this go. I wasn't going to be the quiet daughter who let things happen, who forgave because it was easier than fighting. I was a cop. I knew how to find things, how to follow paper trails, how to use silence as a weapon. I wasn't just going to get my money back. I was going to make sure they knew exactly what they had done. I was going to make them feel it, not just the loss, but the weight of the betrayal, the sting of being exposed, the shame of having their lies dragged into the light. I was going to take everything they had taken from me and more, and I wasn't going to stop until I looked them both in the eyes and saw the truth sink in, that I was not their victim, not anymore. That was the night Maria died, the one they raised, the one who still believed in family. What was left was something colder, something sharper, something that knew how to wait, how to plan, how to strike. I wasn't just coming back for what was mine, I was coming back for justice, and I was going to enjoy every second of it. I stayed in that motel room for 3 days, barely sleeping, barely eating, just sitting with the folder in my lap, like it might start whispering answers if I stared long enough. It didn't, of course. It just sat there, heavy and still and waiting, like it knew there was more and it wasn't going to give it up easily. I spent hours reading and rereading every document, every account number, every letter from lawyers and banks. The same names came up again and again, names of people I didn't recognize, but they were always CC'd on emails or mentioned in passing, and always tied to my parents in some way. I started writing them down, making lists, timelines, connections. It felt like building a puzzle, except the picture was of a family I didn't recognize, one that lied and stole and smiled through it all like nothing was wrong. In the 4th day, I got a call from my supervisor asking when I was coming back to work. I told him I needed some time, personal loss, and all that. He said he understood, but I could hear the edge in his voice, the kind that meant time was limited and sympathy was running out. I said I'd call him when I was ready and hung up before he could ask any more questions. I didn't want to explain why I couldn't look at a badge or report or fingerprint without thinking of the ones left in my own house, fingerprints of betrayal and greed and silence. That night, I drove back into the city, not home, not yet, but to an old friend, someone I hadn't seen in years. Her name was Claire. We met in the academy. She made it to detective before she quit the force, said she was tired of pretending the system worked the way it was supposed to. I found her bartending at some hole-in-the-wall place on the east side. She didn't recognize me at first. I'd cut my hair, changed my posture, lost the light in my eyes, but once she did, she hugged me so tight I almost cried. She let me crash at her place, a cramped apartment above a laundromat with creaky floors and windows that didn't shut right. It felt like safety even if it smelled like detergent and burnt toast. I didn't tell her everything, not yet, just that my grandfather had died and something felt wrong and I needed help piecing it together. She didn't ask questions, just handed me a blanket and said bathrooms down the hall, and I slept better than I had in weeks. Next morning, I woke up to find her at the table, coffee in one hand, magnifying glass in the other, looking at one of the documents from the folder. She said, "You're right, something's off here," and I felt a weight lift from my chest, like maybe I wasn't crazy, maybe I wasn't just grieving wrong, maybe there was something real buried in all this paper and ink and silence. We spent the next 2 days digging. She called in favors I didn't ask from friends who owed her things. They looked into accounts, traced emails, ran background checks. Nothing official, nothing that would leave a trail, but enough to start seeing the edges of something bigger. My parents hadn't just hidden the trust, they'd moved it, altered it, disguised it through shell companies and fake signatures and backdated paperwork. It was sophisticated, more than they could have done alone, which meant someone was helping them, someone who knew how to make things disappear. That's when I remembered the box in the garage, not the one with the key, the other one, the one with old photos and letters from my grandfather to people I'd never heard of. I asked Claire if I could go back to the house just once to look for it. She said no, too risky, but I told her I needed it. I needed to see what else he'd left behind, so I went alone, parked 2 blocks away, walked the rest of the distance like I was on patrol, heart pounding, ears open, eyes scanning every shadow. I knew my parents wouldn't be home. They had some event that night, something about a fundraiser or a dinner party where they'd smile and shake hands and pretend they were good people. The house looked smaller than I remembered, less like a home, more like a set piece from a play where everyone knew their lines, but no one believed the story. I let myself in through the side door using the key they never asked for back and moved quickly through the kitchen and into the garage. The box was still there, dusty and dented and shoved behind an old cooler. I took it without looking inside and left the same way I came, quiet and fast and invisible. Back at Claire's, we opened it together. Photos, letters, receipts. One envelope stood out. It was addressed to me in my grandfather's handwriting, but never mailed. The stamp was missing. The seal was unbroken. My hands shook as I opened it and unfolded the single sheet of paper. "Insidiate," said Maria. "If you're reading this, it means I didn't get to tell you myself, and I'm sorry for that. You always deserved the truth, and I should have told you sooner, but I was afraid they'd find out. Afraid they'd take it from you before you even knew it existed. They've always been clever, your parents, clever and cruel in ways they don't even recognize. They think money makes them untouchable. They think they can rewrite the past with ink and lies, but you were always my legacy, not the land, not the money, not the house. You set up the trust for you because I knew they'd try to take everything I had, not because they needed it, but because they couldn't stand the idea of you having more. I left clues because I knew if anyone could find them, it was you, not just because of your job, but because of who you are, relentless and good, even when it hurts, especially when it hurts. There's more, and it's not in the papers, it's in the truth about your mother and your father and what they did to me, what they did to you. It's all in the journals I kept, the ones they never found, hidden behind the false panel in my closet. Take them, read them, know everything, then decide what to do, not just for justice, but for peace. Whatever you choose, I believe in you. Always love, Grandpa." Couldn't breathe, not for a long time. Claire sat across from me, silent, letting the words settle around us like ash. I didn't cry, not then. I just sat there, holding the letter like it might vanish if I let go, and I read it again and again until the ink felt burned into my skin. Next day, I went back for the journals, same routine, park walk, enter fast and quiet. This time I went straight to the closet. The false panel was behind the row of winter coats. I slid it aside, and there they were, 3 thick leather-bound journals tied with twine and smelling of tobacco and dust. I didn't open them there, I just grabbed them and ran, heart racing like I was being chased back in the apartment. I opened the first one and started reading, and with every page something in me cracked, not loud, not sudden, but slow, like ice melting under pressure. He wrote about everything, the fights, the threats, the manipulation, how they guilted him, how they cornered him, how they made him feel like a burden in his own home, how they mocked his memory, his generosity, how they talked about me like I was a mistake, a waste, a liability. He wrote about how he Saw through them, how he tried to protect me, how he never stopped loving me even when I pulled away. Documented it all: dates, names, conversations, money movements, their lawyer's name, the offshore account, their silent partner, someone named Bennett, who handled the paperwork and made sure nothing could be traced back to them. He even wrote about the night he decided to hide the key, said it was the only way to keep them from getting everything, the only way to make sure I'd find the truth. Be the end of the second journal. I couldn't sit still. I paced the room reading out loud, not even realizing I was doing it. Claire watched me quietly, occasionally taking notes, occasionally swearing under her breath. We were building a case, not just for what they took, but for how they took it, and why, and who helped them. Be the third journal. I had names, dates, motives, evidence enough to shake everything they'd built, and I realized something terrifying. They weren't just trying to steal money. They were trying to erase him, erase me, rewrite the family history into something shiny and hollow and false, and they almost got away with it, but they died him because he trusted me to find the pieces. And now I had them. He spent the next few days organizing everything, scanning documents, cross-referencing bank records, matching journal entries with legal filings. I reached out to a lawyer. Claire recommended someone who specialized in family estate fraud. She said the case was stronger than most she'd seen, and that if we moved carefully, we could not only reclaim the trust but press charges for fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. But I wasn't ready to move, not yet. I needed to understand what it all meant, not just legally but personally. I needed to know how two people who raised me could do something so calculated, so cold. I replayed every moment of my childhood, every smile, every punishment, every holiday, and I started to see it: the way they turned me against him, the way they made me feel guilty for being close to him, the way they used love as leverage and silence as control. He started writing everything down, not just the facts, but the feelings, the memories, the way the carpet felt under my knees when they made me apologize for things I didn't do, the way my mother's voice went sharp when I questioned anything, the way my father disappeared into his study and only came out to correct me, not comfort me. I wrote until my hand ached, until my brain buzzed, until there was nothing left but the truth. And then I stopped writing and I started planning, because it wasn't enough to now. He had to act, not just for Mebut, for him, for everything they tried to bear, for everything I was about to bring to light. I thought I was prepared. I thought reading the journals and seeing the documents and connecting all the names and dates would harden me, make me immune to whatever came next. But nothing can really prepare you for the moment when you look your own parents in the face and realize they see you as an obstacle, not a daughter. Nothing can prepare you for the kind of betrayal that wears your last name and sleeps in your old bed and smiles like it raised you out of love. He didn't tell Claire where I was going that morning. I just left before sunrise, wearing jeans and a dark hoodie and boots that didn't make noise on hardwood floors. I didn't bring a bag, just the folder and the journals tucked under my arm like weapons, because that's what they had become, tools for cutting through years of lies and silence. The sky was still a dull blue when I parked down the street from the house I grew up in and walked the rest of the way past the hedges I used to help trim and the mailbox I once hit with my bike. I walked up the steps slowly, feeling like I was returning to a crime scene, and maybe I was. My mother opened the door, still in her robe, holding a coffee cup and blinking like I had woken her from a pleasant dream. She looked older than I remembered, more fragile, but I didn't let that fool me. I had read the things she said about me in those journals. I had seen the signatures she placed on the forged documents. I had memorized the bank account she opened in her name and filled with money meant for me, and all of that sat behind my eyes as I walked past her without speaking and into the living room where my father sat watching the news with the volume low, like he didn't want the world to interrupt him. They didn't ask why I was there, they just looked at me, waiting, like they already knew this moment was coming and had rehearsed how to play their parts. I stood in front of them and held out the papers, not as a question but as a statement of fact. They didn't reach for them, they didn't flinch, they just waited, and I realized they weren't surprised. They had expected this or something like it. They just didn't expect me to come so far so fast. He told them I knew everything about the trust, the forged signatures, the hidden accounts, the offshore transactions. I told them I had the journals and that I had copies stored safely elsewhere. I told them I had spoken to a lawyer and I was ready to press charges unless they came clean. Unless they told me why. Me mother laughed, not loud, not cruel, just soft and tired, like I had asked her to explain gravity. She said things were complicated. She said I didn't understand how hard life had been for them, how much they had sacrificed, how much they had given up for me, how sometimes people did things out of desperation, and I almost believed her, almost, until I remembered the letters and the dates and the money spent on vacations and parties and things I was never invited to. Me. Father didn't say anything at first, just stared at the screen like it held the answer to a question no one had asked. When he finally spoke, he said it was just money, that it didn't change anything, that I was still their daughter and they still loved me, and couldn't we just move past all this and be a family again? And I felt something break inside me, something old and brittle and barely holding. Oni asked them if they ever planned to tell me, if they ever thought maybe I deserved to know the truth, if they ever once considered how it might feel to lose the only man who ever believed in me, and then discover that they had taken the last thing he left me and buried it like a secret, like I was a secret. Me mother said it was better this way, that I would have wasted it or given it away or gotten myself hurt. She said I didn't know how the world worked, that I wasn't built for that kind of responsibility, that I didn't understand what it meant to protect a legacy, and I realized then that she wasn't talking about the money, she was talking about power and image and the lie they had built and polished and presented to the world like a trophy. Didn't apologize, not once, not even when I cried, not even when I screamed, not even when I told them I would never forgive them. They just stood there watching me like I was a storm they didn't have to outrun because they thought it would pass, because it always had before. But not this team. I turned and walked out the door without another word. I didn't take anything, not a photo, not a piece of jewelry, not a letter. I left it all behind because it wasn't mine anymore, because none of it ever was. I walked to my car and drove until the city was behind me and the sky had turned gold, and I didn't stop until I reached Claire's apartment and collapsed onto the floor and didn't move. For Horsey didn't sleep that night, not because I couldn't, but because I didn't want to. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces, calm and indifferent and utterly convinced they had done nothing wrong. I thought about all the years I spent trying to be good, trying to make them proud, trying to earn something that was supposed to be unconditional, and I felt ashamed, not for what they did, but for what I let them take from me, for how long I let them take it. Claire didn't ask what happened when I came back. She just handed me a cup of tea and said I looked different, and I knew she was right. I felt different, like something inside me had been cut away and burned, like I had finally stopped bleeding but hadn't yet started to heal. I told her everything, every word, every look, every lie, and she sat there nodding, not saying much, just letting it all come out. Over the next few days, we started putting together a plan, not just legal but strategic. We mapped out every asset, every account, every connection, every potential ally or enemy. We created timelines and cross-reference statements and started compiling a report that would make any prosecutor's mouth water. But that wasn't enough, not for me, because this wasn't just about getting back what was mine. It was about making sure they couldn't do this again to anyone else, to their friends, their clients, their future victims. He reached out to a journalist I knew from a case I worked 2 years back, someone who specialized in corruption and family scandals, and sent her copies of the documents with no names attached just yet. She read them and called me an hour later and said this could blow up a neighborhood, and I told her good, let it burn. Lawyer filed the preliminary injunction and froze the accounts. Within a week, my parents received notice that their finances were being investigated and that a formal claim was being brought against them for fraud and embezzlement and breach of trust. I imagined their faces reading the envelope, the confusion turning to fear, turning to panic. And I felt nothing, not satisfaction, not regret, just nothing, like the hole they left in me had finally gone. Numby moved out of Claire's place and into a small apartment downtown. It wasn't much, just one room and a kitchenette, but it was mine. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was hiding. I started going back to work part-time, easing into routine, filing reports, answering calls, doing what I could to stay grounded. My supervisor didn't ask why I left or what I had been doing. He just nodded when I walked in and said welcome back, and that was enough. At night, I read my grandfather's journals again, this time slower, not for clues but for connection. I read his words and felt him beside me like a shadow. That didn't haunt but held. I wrote back, sometimes not on paper but in my mind, telling him what I had done, what I was going to do, how I missed him, how I wished he could see me now, and I imagined him smiling, that quiet proud smile that said he knew this would happen, that he knew I'd make it through. Betrayal didn't end that day in the living room. It echoed in every phone call I ignored, in every photo I took off the wall, in every silence that used to be filled with trust. It would echo for a long time, maybe forever, but I wasn't afraid of it anymore, because I had survived it, because I had seen the worst of them and walked away stronger, because I had lost everything and found myself in the wreckage. This wasn't over, not by a long shot, but the war had begun, and I wasn't alone anymore. I had the truth, I had the law, I had the fire in my chest that refused to go out, and I had the memory of a man who believed in stars, because I did, and that was enough to keep going. That was enough to win. I always thought I knew how to hunt, not the kind with rifles or deer stands, but the kind that required silence and patience and the ability to disappear when needed. In the academy, they taught us how to observe, how to move without being seen, how to study patterns until they unraveled on their own, but nothing in training ever prepared me for hunting my own blood, for peeling back the skin of a life built on Sunday dinners and school drop-offs and finding something rotten pulsing underneath. The accounts were frozen. I knew they would panic, but I also knew panic wouldn't stop them. Not yet, not people like my parents. They had money tucked away, more than I had found, and I needed to know where every cent had gone, because this wasn't about what they stole anymore. It was about the system they built around the theft, the names they used, the people they paid, the hands that stayed clean while the knives were buried. Claire helped me set up a burner laptop, clean network, separate from anything that could be traced. We used software she still had access to from her time in the department, unofficial copies of tools meant for organized crime but perfect for unraveling financial fraud. We built timelines, we mapped emails, we ran searches on every entity tied to my family's name, and every time we hit something new, it felt like picking at a scab that never healed. There was a woman named Valerie. She showed up on 3 different documents, all signed months apart and under different business titles. I traced her to a property management firm on the other side of the state and called, pretending to be a potential investor. She answered on the 3rd ring, chipper, polite and oblivious. I asked about a building listed under one of the shell companies my parents had used. She put me on hold for a moment, then came back and said I'd have to speak to Mr. Bennett. That name again, Bennett had been a ghost until then, a name in a journal, a shadow in the corner of emails. Now he had a voice, a location, a role, and I wrote it all down: the building, the floor, the office hours. I dug into his background and found just enough to confirm what I had suspected. He was a financial cleaner, the kind that helped wealthy people make things go away, and he'd been on my parents' payroll for years, quietly and efficiently scrubbing their trails while they smiled for holiday cards. He needed more than names. I needed proof, enough to make the doll listen, enough to make the press take notice, enough to make sure they never did this to anyone again. So I made an appointment under a false name, told the receptionist I was looking to restructure an inheritance. Bennett agreed to see me the next afternoon. I wore a suit I hadn't touched since graduation, clean lines, dark colors, no badge, no folder, just a notepad and the kind of smile that said I had money to hide and no questions about how it worked. His office was on the top floor, sterile and cold, with windows to clean and chairs to white. He offered me water. I declined. He asked about the inheritance. I told him it was complicated old money wrapped in family drama and lawsuits, and that I wanted it untangled as discreetly as possible. He smiled like he had heard it all before and began asking questions: names, amounts, countries. I gave him enough to keep him talking, just enough to let him slip, and then it happened. He'd mentioned a trust format that matched the one my grandfather had used down to the year and location, a very specific legal structure that hadn't been in use for decades unless you knew exactly what to look for. He said it so casually, like it meant nothing, but I felt the air shift and I knew I had. He ended the meeting politely, took his card, smiled and left, but not before noticing the framed photo on his desk, a charity gala from 3 years ago, my parents standing beside him, drinks in hand, laughing like everything was exactly as it should be. Back in the apartment, I told Claire everything. We printed the photo, marked the timeline, added his name to the central report, and started reaching out to contacts in state finance records. We found links between his firm and 7 other families, all under investigation for tax evasion or fraud, and suddenly, this wasn't just my story anymore, it was a web, and my parents were only one part of it. Journalist I had contacted before asked for a meeting. I agreed, this time face to face in a diner far from downtown. I gave her the documents, the photo, the reports, the journal pages with names underlined in red. She read them silently, one after the other, her face hardening with every page. When she finally looked up, she said, "This will destroy them," and I nodded because I wanted it to, not just for revenge, but for every lie they sold wrapped in good intentions and warm smile. She said she needed a week to verify sources. I told her I'd give her 3 days while she worked. I kept digging. I went through my father's old contacts, found a cousin who worked in real estate, and remembered overhearing something about a property transferred under a fake name. I tracked the address to a vacation home to states over, bought in cash and never lived in. I cross-referenced the sale date with a large withdrawal from the frozen account made just days before the order went through and added it to the report. He started to feel the walls closing in around them, not physically, but legally. Every day brought another thread unraveled, another lie exposed. I sent the entire file to the estate lawyer, who told me it was more than enough to file criminal charges and initiate a civil suit for damages and breach of fiduciary duty. He said we could reclaim the trust in full, plus interest, plus penalties, plus legal fees, and that was just the beginning. He also said something else, something I hadn't thought about until then, that once the suit became public, everything else would too: the money, the fraud, the names, the alliances, the photo of Bennett smiling with a drink in hand and his arm around my mother's waist, and I realized that the legacy they tried so hard to protect was about to be burned to the ground. Claire looked at me that night as I stood by the window, the report in one hand and my phone in the other, and asked if I was ready. I told her I had been ready since the day I found the key, since the day I climbed onto that garage roof and felt something shift inside me. I wasn't just ready, I was done waiting. Journalists published the story 2 days later, front page, top headline, complete with scanned documents and highlighted quotes from the journal's anonymous sources close to the investigation, and a closing line that said the DA had been contacted for comment and that charges were being considered. The fallout was immediate. Headlines, social media whispers turned to screams. My parents' names trended for hours, not because they were famous, but because their disgrace was public, and poetic calls came in from people hadn't spoken to in years, friends, family, coworkers, all asking if it was true, if I was okay, if I really did this, and I answered the same way every time: yes, I'm okay. And yes, it's true. They tried to contact me at first, emails, texts, voicemails. I didn't listen, I didn't read, I let them pile up until the silence grew louder than their words could ever be. Eventually, the messages stopped, replaced by subpoenas and court notices and lawyers calling to settle, and every time they tried to delay or deflect, my lawyer sent another file, another piece of proof, another reminder that I wasn't bluffing. These started losing things, first the accounts, then the house. Then the fake companies began collapsing one by one like dominoes, and every time a name vanished from the registry or a partner withdrew their funds, I felt a little lighter, like I was finally taking back space in a world they had tried to erase me from. But it wasn't joy, not really. It was justice, and justice is cold and quiet and relentless. It doesn't celebrate, it doesn't weep, it just moves forward one step at a time until there is nothing left to hide. Bahindi went back to the grave. One evening just before sunset, the cemetery was empty, the sky a bruised purple. I stood over his name etched in stone and whispered everything I had done, every piece I had uncovered, every lie I had burned down. I told him I found the truth, that I made them look me in the eyes and see what they had created, and I promised him it wasn't over, not yet, not until everything they built on my silence was turned to a shand. As I stood there, I realized something: I wasn't just hunting them anymore. I was reclaiming myself. Every step, every document, every courtroom was a step away from the girl who once begged for their approval, and a step toward the woman who now demanded accountability. This was more than revenge, it was restoration, and I wasn't stopping until the last piece was mine again. I used to think justice was a moment, a gavel, a sentence, a headline, something loud and final and clean, but I know better now. I know it's a slow, deliberate unraveling, like a knot pulled tight for years, loosening one thread at a time until the whole thing falls apart quietly and completely. I didn't want revenge in fire or screaming. I wanted silence. I wanted them to feel the cold absence of control, the helplessness of being seen, the weight of being known, and the fear that came with no longer holding the pen to write their own story. The trap was already set before they even knew I was building one. Every conversation they had was a move, every lie they told a thread I pulled, and I didn't have to bait them, I just had to wait. Because people like them don't stop, they double down, they convince themselves they're untouchable, and that's when they make mistakes, the kind they can't erase with a phone call or a signature. The article did its job, the headlines did their damage, the bank accounts were frozen, the estate was contested, the lawyer confirmed, the judge had agreed to an expedited hearing, and for the first time since I started this, I felt like I wasn't fighting uphill, I was standing level, looking across the battlefield and watching the other side stumble. They try to move assets again through a secondary proxy, someone listed as a business associate of my father's from over a decade ago, but we were already watching the account. The transfer was flagged and reported, and within 24 hours a formal investigation was opened. Claire and I tracked the paperwork and found inconsistencies, dates that didn't match, signatures that were suspiciously identical to ones we had already flagged, and the moment that evidence was submitted to the court, the judge issued a temporary order blocking any further movement until a hearing. They tried to issue a statement through a lawyer claiming misinformation, slander, manipulation by a disgruntled family member. They didn't say my name, but everyone knew they meant me, and for a moment I almost laughed because they still thought they could spin this, still thought they could talk their way out of a documented fraud trail that stretched over years across 3 states and into at least 5 separate financial institutions. She contacted my lawyer and asked for a meeting, not an interrogation, not an interview, a meeting to discuss the timeline, the evidence, the possibility of a formal charge. I sat in that office with my hands on the table and my eyes locked forward, and I told them everything, every piece, every journal entry, every document, every login, every shell company, every time I walked into a room and smiled at people who had stolen from me and said nothing because I was still building the cassette. They listened, they took notes, they asked questions, and when it was done, the DA said we were looking at a clear pattern of deliberate financial manipulation, and that charges could include fraud, forgery, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. The words didn't even hit me at first because I was so used to carrying the story alone, and now someone else was saying it out loud, and it made it real. Me parents were served at home one evening, papers and hand, cameras across the street, neighbors whispering behind hedges. They looked exactly like I remembered, calm, polished eyes, dead and distant. They denied everything at first, of course, told the reporters they would clear their name, claimed political targeting, personal vendettas, anything to shift the blame, but the world had already turned against them, and the silence that followed their denial was louder than anything they could say. Kept going. I didn't slow down. I filed additional motions to have the full trust returned to my control. I requested a court-appointed auditor to review the estate. I asked for a restraining order barring them from contacting me directly or through legal counsel without prior approval, and I got all of it, not because I was their daughter, not because I was hurt, but because I had proof and the law was finally on my side. The final blow wasn't the hearing or the press or the freezing of accounts. It was the deposition. I watched it from a private room, live feed camera locked on them as they sat in a bland office flanked by lawyers and tried to explain the unexplainable. They stuttered, they stalled, they passed blame back and forth. My father blaming a consultant, my mother blaming confusion, my father blaming oversight, my mother claiming she never read the documents, my father denying he ever signed, and then the screen showed the scanned journal entry, his exact words copied line for line and dated 2 years before he ever denied anything, and I watched his eyes falter, and I knew he remembered writing. Ith trap wasn't the paperwork or the lawyer or the press, it was the truth laid out piece by piece so patiently they didn't even feel it closing around them until it was too late. They weren't just exposed, they were undone not by force but by their own hands, by their arrogance, their certainty that I wouldn't fight back, that I would stay small, quiet. Obediently called me again one last time. Days before the final hearing, the number showed up on the screen and I stared at it for a long time. My thumb hovered and then I let it ring out because there was nothing left to say and they had already said everything. In their actions, in their choices, in their silence. Claire sat with me on the morning of the hearing. We didn't talk much, we didn't need to. She just poured coffee and handed me the file and said, "You're ready," and I nodded because I was more than ready. I was done. The courtroom was colder than I expected, quiet, echoing, full of strangers wearing suits and holding folders and whispering into phones. My lawyer stood beside me, calm, measured, professional. The judge entered and everyone stood, and then it began. He didn't look at them, not once. Not when they walked in, not when they sat down, not when they whispered to their attorney and pointed at me like I was the cause of all this instead of the result. I kept my eyes on the judge, on the file, on the truth. My lawyer spoke clearly, methodically, laying out the timeline, the evidence, the journals, the bank statements, the recordings, the forensic signatures, the offshore accounts, the pattern of deception and control and silence. The judge listened, asked questions, nodded slowly, and I watched as the weight of it all settled across the room like fog. Their lawyer tried to dismiss, tried to discredit, brought up my emotional state, my alleged vendetta, my position on the force, implied that I used my resources unethically, but none of it stuck. Because we had been so careful, so methodical, and every accusation they made only highlighted how desperate they had become. And then the judge spoke, and it wasn't loud or dramatic, it was precise and final and absolute. The trust was to be restored. The assets returned, the damages assessed, the court costs assigned, and the criminal investigation referred for prosecution. I felt my chest rise, but I didn't cry, not there, not in front of them. I just nodded once and stood and walked out of that room like I was leaving a cage I had lived in my whole life. Outside, the sun was too bright, the world too loud, the street too open, and for the first time in years I felt like I was standing on solid ground. It wasn't over, there were still hearings and filings and stories and rumors, but the worst part was done. The silence was broken, the truth was named, and I was no longer the one who dingy went home that night to my apartment, still half furnished, still smelling like new paint and old hope. And I opened the last journal, the one I hadn't touched since the beginning, and I read the final entry from my grandfather, and it said, "I always knew you'd find your way through, and I believe in who you are, and I believe in what you'll become." I closed the book and sat in the quiet and let myself breathe for the first time in a very long time. The trap had worked, but more importantly, I had escaped. There's no, it was time to build something new from the pieces they tried to break. There is a kind of silence that follows storms, not the quiet of peace, but the emptiness that remains after everything has been broken and scattered and left to settle again. I used to think I would feel something enormous at the end of all this. Victory or joy or maybe relief, but what I felt was stillness, not numbness, not detachment, just stillness, like the inside of a room after the lights are turned off and you can hear your own breath. Against legal process didn't end overnight. There were documents to sign, assets to transfer, accounts to close and reopen, but it all moved forward, and every signature, every stamped paper was another step out of their shadow. The trust was returned in full, plus interest, plus penalties. The money came in clean and official, wired to a new account under my name alone, a name they could no longer touch or twist or hide behind. Didn't spend it right away, didn't even look at the balance for days, not because I was afraid, but because I needed to remember what it felt like to stand without it. I needed to know that the fight had changed me more than the outcome had, that I was no longer the girl who once thought being good and quiet would be enough. Claire was the first to celebrate. Not with champagne or music, but with a new lock on my front door and a small plant for the windowsill, something green, something growing. She said it was time to bring life back into the space, and I believed her because she had stayed through every broken moment and never once asked for anything in return. He started putting my life back together slowly, piece by piece. I went back to work part-time, then full. I started running again in the mornings, listening to the sound of my feet on pavement like proof that I was still here, still moving. I took cases again, smaller ones first, background checks, missing items, simple fraud things I understood in my bones now in a way I never had before. Me supervisors noticed the difference, not in my work but in my eyes. I didn't flinch at lies anymore. I didn't pause before asking the hard questions. I had walked through fire, and I carried its echo in my voice, not loud, not aggressive, just sure. I knew what people were capable of now, and I didn't need to pretend otherwise. I visited his grave again, the final time, not to ask for guidance or strength, but to say thank you. I brought fresh flowers and sat on the grass and told him everything, how it ended, what they said, what the judge ruled, how I had changed, what I planned to do next. I didn't cry, not because I wasn't sad, but because the grief had shifted. It wasn't heavy anymore. It was something warm, like a hand on my shoulder, reminding me that I had been loved, even when I didn't know it. After the final court date, I received a letter from their lawyer, not a threat, not a settlement, just a statement saying they would not appeal, that they accepted the ruling, that they would cease contact. I read it once, folded it twice, and put it in a drawer. I didn't need closure from them. I didn't need anything from them. Anna Marie used a small part of the money to make repairs to the house where he raised me. I didn't move back in, but I couldn't let it rot, not after everything it had seen. I hired a local team to fix the roof, the wiring, the plumbing. I asked them to leave the garage untouched. I needed that part to remain exactly as it was, the place where I found the key, where everything changed. I donated most of his personal belongings to a local archive that preserved family histories, journals, letters, records. They accepted everything with care and promised to catalog it properly. His words would live on now, not hidden, not buried, not locked in a metal box, but available for others to read, to understand, to remember. The rest of the money I placed in two accounts, one for investment, one for impact. I funded a small program through Claire's old department focused on financial education for women, especially those leaving abusive homes or family manipulation. Not charity, not pity, just access and tools and language I never had when I needed it most. He bought nothing extravagant, no cars, no jewelry, no sudden escape. I kept my apartment. I kept my routines. I kept the quiet I had earned. I didn't need more. I just needed to hold what I had without fear of it being taken. The calls stopped, the whispers stopped, the headlines faded, and in their place came silence, not the silence of absence but of stability. I woke up one morning and realized I had nothing to chase, no lie to uncover, no truth to prove, and I stood in the middle of the room with my hands open and let that feeling sink in. One afternoon months later, I received a letter, no return address, handwritten on thick paper. It was from my mother, short, careful, each word chosen like it might break. She said she was sorry, not for what they did, but for the way it ended. She said she hoped I had found peace. She said she would not write again unless I wanted her to, and she signed it simply with her name. Not mom, not mother, just the woman who once brought me into the world and then tried to take it from me. I didn't write back. I didn't need to. I placed the letter in the same drawer as the one from their lawyer and closed it. Slow life. Truth is, I had forgiven her, not out of mercy or weakness, but because I didn't want to carry her anymore, her or him or their lies or their names. Forgiveness was a release, not a reunion. It was the door I walked through alone into a life they could never enter. Time moved forward, seasons shifted, the air grew cold then warm again. I learned to sit still without scanning for danger. I learned to enjoy quiet without waiting for the next blow. I learned that survival is not the same as healing, but it is the first step. Morning, I stood in the kitchen making coffee and realized I was happy, not euphoric, not glowing, just quietly, completely okay. I looked around at the space I had built and realized it was enough, and that I had made it, that I had taken the worst parts of my story and turned them into something solid, something unshakable. This was not a fairy tale. There was no bow, no neat ending, no justice that erased the past, but there was movement, there was growth. There was a woman who once had everything stolen from her and who now stood whole in her own name, and that was the return, not to who I was, but to who I had always been before they tried to write me out, before they tried to bend my life into something that suited their version of control. Was Maria. I was 25, was a police officer. I was a survivor. I was the granddaughter of a man who believed in me, and I had come back From the fire not burned but brightened this time, no one would take that from me again. Thanks for listening to my story with me. Don't forget to subscribe and follow for more stories.